"Stop!" A shout echoed through the mountain air, slicing through the tension like a knife. The desperate plea of an obedient girl hung in the balance as a mountain man made his shocking declaration. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The mountain sun barely cleared the ridgeline, painting the frozen landscape in hues of amber and gold. John Smith descended from his remote cabin, each heavy footfall breaking through the thin crust of morning frost. His weathered boots pounded the frozen ground with the same rhythm as his heart hammered against his ribs. He hadn't planned to visit the village today, or any day, but something had pulled him down from his solitude, an unease he couldn't name. The village square bustled with early morning activity. Traders arranged their meager wares on rough-hewn tables, while villagers huddled in small groups, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. John kept to the shadows, watching. He'd spent years avoiding these people, preferring the honest company of wilderness to the complicated dance of human interaction. That's when he saw her, a girl, painfully thin, standing with downcast eyes beside a trader John didn't recognize. The stranger gripped the girl's arm with unnecessary force, displaying her like merchandise while haggling with several interested parties. The girl trembled but made no sound, her silence more disturbing than any cry could have been. "2 silver pieces for this one," the trader announced. "Strong enough for work, quiet as a mouse." Something snapped inside John. Before he could think, he was striding across the square, his tall frame casting a long shadow. Conversations died as villagers noticed the hermit's approach, their expressions shifting from surprise to wariness. "Stop!" John's voice cracked through the morning air like a whip. "I'll buy her!" The square fell into stunned silence. No one had seen John Smith speak more than 3 words together in years, let alone interfere in village matters. The trader, a wiry woman with calculating eyes, looked up in surprise, her grip loosening slightly on the girl's arm. "The hermit speaks," someone whispered, and nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. John stood his ground, glaring at anyone who dared meet his gaze. The fury in his eyes was something new and dangerous, even to those who had long whispered about the mountain man's mysterious past. The girl flinched at his outburst, but didn't raise her head. She stood motionless, thin as a willow branch in winter, her fate suspended in the tense silence between John's unexpected demand and the trader's obvious greed. For a breathless moment, the entire village seemed frozen in tableau. The hermit, the trader, the silent girl, and the circle of onlookers, all caught in the amber light of early morning. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant cry of a hawk circling above the mountains. Free in ways the trembling girl could only dream of, John Smith pulled the leather pouch from his coat, the weight of silver coins representing months of solitary work, trapping in the harshest conditions, trading pelts, and living on less than most would consider bearable. He pressed it firmly into Mary Johnson's calloused palm, his weathered fingers lingering just long enough to convey a silent warning. "It's more than she's worth," Mary said, her wiry frame tensing as she assessed both the payment and the unexpected buyer. The trader's eyes darted between the coins and John's unflinching gaze, her business instincts battling with a newfound wariness. Few in the village had ever seen the hermit this close, let alone engaged in trade with him, especially not for a person. "Take it," John growled, his voice rough from disuse, "and let her go." Mary weighed the pouch in her hand, the clink of silver speaking a language she understood perfectly. Profit won over caution. With a non-committal shrug that attempted to mask her relief at concluding this unusual transaction, she released her grip on the rope binding the girl's wrists. "She's yours then," the trader announced, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "No returns, mountain man." The villagers formed a loose circle around them, keeping a cautious distance. Their whispers created a current of unease that rippled through the square. An elderly woman spat on the ground, but child was quickly pulled behind his mother's skirts. "The hermit's finally lost his mind," someone muttered. "Bad luck to interfere with a proper trade," another voice added. John ignored them all, focusing instead on the girl who stood motionless, eyes downcast, as if awaiting her next command. Emily Davis, though he didn't yet know her name, remained perfectly still, her thin shoulders hunched against whatever might come next. "Come," he said simply, turning toward the path that led up the mountain. From the shadow of her doorway, Sarah Brown observed the scene with keen interest. The village healer's gnarled hands clutched her walking stick as she studied the unexpected pair. Unlike the others, whose faces showed only fear and judgment, Sarah's expression held something deeper, recognition perhaps. Her eyes, still sharp despite her advanced years, followed John and the girl as they made their way through the parting crowd. "So it begins," she whispered to herself, feeling the subtle shift in the mountain's energy, a change as tangible to her as the coming of a storm. Thomas would need to hear of this, she decided. The elder would understand the significance of what had just transpired. As John led Emily away from the village square, the distance between them and the community seemed both physical and symbolic. A gap that had existed for years, suddenly bridged by the presence of this silent, obedient girl. Neither of them realized that with each step, they were walking into a story far older than either could imagine. The cabin door creaked shut behind them, sealing Emily Davis inside John's world of solitude. The space was cramped but orderly, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn table, and narrow cot pushed against the far wall. Without being told, Emily moved toward the broom leaning in the corner and began sweeping the packed dirt floor. John Smith watched her, unsettled by how naturally she fell into servitude. "You don't have to do that right away," he muttered, but she continued as if she hadn't heard him, her thin shoulders hunched in concentration. Over the next 3 days, Emily anticipated his needs before he voiced them. She gathered kindling from the forest edge, filled buckets from the icy creek that cut through the property, and kept the fire stoked without instruction. Her efficiency was unnerving. Not once did she complain about the bitter cold or the weight of the water pails that made her arms tremble. The hermit found himself speaking aloud more than he had in years, if only to fill the silence. "Storm's coming," he'd comment, or "rabbit stew tonight." Emily would nod, but rarely respond. It was her eyes that troubled him most, dark pools that seemed to hold memories far older than her young frame should carry. At night, John would lie awake listening to the wind howl across the mountain slopes. Then, when she thought he was asleep, Emily would begin to sing. The melodies were soft, barely above a whisper, but they cut through him like a knife. Old mountain songs, lullabies his mother had sung, ballads that had echoed through village celebrations decades ago. "Where did you learn those songs?" he asked her one morning, his voice rougher than intended. The girl looked up from the porridge she was stirring. "Everyone knows them," she replied, her first complete sentence since arriving. That night, as the songs drifted through the cabin again, memories flooded back. His brother's laughter, his father's stern face, his mother's gentle hands. The betrayal that had driven him to this solitary existence felt suddenly raw again, as if the wound had never truly healed. John rose before dawn, escaping to check his traps, needing distance from the emotions the child stirred within him. The familiar routine of survival had always been enough. Now, with Emily's presence, the loneliness he'd convinced himself was freedom felt hollow. When he returned, she was waiting, having prepared a simple meal and laid out his tools for repair. Something in her quiet efficiency reminded him of Sarah Brown, the village healer. The same careful movements, the same watchful eyes. "Tomorrow," he said gruffly, "I'll show you how to set snares." It wasn't much, but it was the first time he'd offered to teach rather than command. Emily nodded, and for a brief moment, the sorrow in her eyes lightened. Rumors swept through the village like wildfire, crackling from home to home, with the intensity of dry kindling catching flame. By midday, every soul in the settlement had heard how John Smith had disrupted the sacred balance of their mountain community. Children were hushed when they asked questions, and women exchanged knowing glances over steaming pots of stew. "That girl is marked," whispered a trader to her customer, both glancing nervously toward the path leading to John's cabin. "No one gets sold like that unless they're carrying a curse." Sarah Brown, the village healer, had quietly given the silent child a name, Emily Davis, and offered John bundles of dried herbs when he reluctantly came down for supplies. The old woman's kindness stood in stark contrast to the suspicion festering among others. "Mark my words," Robert Johnson declared, hammering a glowing horseshoe with unnecessary force. The blacksmith's voice carried across the square, deliberately loud enough for passing villagers to hear. "That hermit's interference will bring ruin to us all. The mountain demands balance, and he's upset it." Sweat glistened on his brow as he plunged the metal into water, steam hissing like a warning. Even Thomas Brown, the respected village elder, seemed troubled. Villagers noticed how he stared into the communal fire each evening, muttering about omens and signs. "The flames speak of change," he told those who gathered around him. "Not all change brings blessing." Up in his cabin, John tried to ignore the whispers that followed him during his infrequent trips to the village. He'd never cared for their opinions before, and told himself he didn't start now. Yet Emily's presence gnawed at the comfortable solitude he'd built around himself like a protective wall. She moved through this small home like a shadow, careful not to disturb anything. Her thin fingers worked diligently at whatever task he assigned, sweeping the rough wooden floor, arranging his trapping tools, or tending the small fire. She seemed determined to be useful, to justify her presence in his life. At night, when Emily thought he was asleep, John would catch glimpses of her staring out the single window toward the distant village lights. Something in her gaze, a longing perhaps, stirred uncomfortable memories within him. Each day, her silent presence forced him to remember the pain of his own losses, family, connection, belonging, and sparked something he had long denied himself: hope. John found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, wondering about the life she'd led before. He'd saved her on impulse, but now her very existence challenged the isolation he'd so carefully constructed. The quiet space between them filled with unasked questions, neither ready to bridge the gap with words. The midsummer festival bathed the mountain village in golden light as John Smith led Emily Davis down from their isolated cabin. He debated attending at all, but something in the girl's wistful glances toward the village had softened his resolve. Lanterns hung from pine branches, casting dancing shadows across weathered faces. The air hummed with anticipation, thick with the aroma of roasting lamb and bundles of drying herbs strung between posts. "Stay close," John murmured as they approached. The hermit positioned himself at the gathering's edge, his broad shoulders tense. Emily stood silently beside him, her thin frame nearly hidden in the oversized shawl Sarah had given her. The villagers noticed their arrival immediately. Conversations faltered, replaced by hushed whispers and sidelong glances. Thomas Brown, the village elder, acknowledged them with a solemn nod from his place of honor, while Robert glared from beside the communal fire pit, his muscular blacksmith's arms crossed in obvious disapproval. "The mountain welcomes all on this night," Sarah called out, approaching them with a wooden cup of sweet berry wine. The healer pressed it into John's reluctant hands with a knowing smile. "Even those who prefer solitude." When the drums began their ancient rhythm, the circle formed naturally. Children ran laughing into the open space first, followed by young men and women. The music swelled, drums, pipes, and strings merging into melodies passed down through generations. Emily watched, transfixed. Her fingers tapped unconsciously against her leg, matching the beat. When a young girl grabbed her hand, Emily startled but didn't pull away. The child tugged her toward the circle, and after a questioning glance at John, she followed. Her first steps were hesitant, almost fearful. She mimicked the others, her movements stiff and uncertain. But as the drums quickened, something awakened in her. Her body remembered what her mind had forgotten. Her feet found the patterns, her hands traced ancient gestures in the air. Mary Johnson paused her trading to watch, surprise evident on her weathered face. "The girl dances like someone born to the mountain," she remarked to no one in particular. Several villagers nodded in appreciation. An elderly woman clapped in rhythm, encouraging Emily with a toothless smile. Even Thomas leaned forward on his carved staff, eyes narrowed with interest. But not everyone was charmed. Robert spat into the fire, muttering about outsiders and broken traditions. A cluster of villagers near him frowned, their expressions darkening as Emily's dance grew more confident. John watched it all, conflicted. Pride warmed his chest at Emily's courage, yet fear gnawed at him. The girl was finding her place, but at what cost? In the flickering light, he could see both the growing admiration and the deepening resentment that surrounded her. The music reached its crescendo, and Emily's dance ended with a final, perfect turn. For one breathless moment, she belonged completely to the mountain and its people. The rockslide came without warning, a thunderous cascade of stone and earth that devoured the northern path like a hungry beast. John Smith stood at the edge of the village, watching as decades of careful trail-making vanished beneath tons of mountain debris. The distant road, their lifeline to the outside world, was gone. 3 months at least before we can clear it. Thomas Brown announced grimly to the gathered villagers. If we start now, we might have access before the first heavy snows. Food supplies dwindled quickly. The village hadn't prepared for isolation, and as hunger gnawed at bellies, fear found fertile ground. Whispers turned to mutters, mutters to accusations. Emily Davis became the focus of their anxiety, the outsider who had arrived just before disaster struck. "The mountain rejects her," Robert hissed to anyone who would listen. The blacksmith's words carried weight, especially among those already suspicious of John's hermit ways. "Smith brought her here against the natural order. Now we all pay the price." John ignored the accusations, but he couldn't ignore the reality of their situation. In his cabin, he pulled out traps that hadn't seen use in years. "Watch carefully," he instructed Emily, demonstrating how to set the mechanism without catching her own fingers. Her hands trembled as she attempted to mimic his movements, the wire snapping painfully against her skin. "I can't," she whispered after her 5th failure. "You can," he replied simply. "You will." Day after day, John taught her the skills of survival. How to identify edible roots that grew in the shadow of pine trees, which mushrooms would nourish and which would kill. How to read clouds for coming weather. Emily struggled with each lesson, her thin fingers better suited to village tasks than wilderness survival. "In the square, I only carried water and swept floors," she admitted one evening, nursing blistered hands. John nodded, understanding her unspoken longing for the predictable rhythms of village life, however harsh they had been. "The village can't feed you now," he said, "and I won't always be here to do it." Something shifted in Emily's expression. Fear, perhaps, or the first recognition that her survival was ultimately her own responsibility. The next morning, she rose before John and reset the fallen traps without being asked. Sarah Brown visited occasionally, bringing what meager herbs she could spare. "The village blames the girl," the healer warned John quietly. "Be careful." "Let them blame," John replied, watching as Emily successfully skinned a rabbit she had caught herself. "We'll eat while they point fingers." A small, determined smile crossed Emily's face as she worked, the first real smile John had seen from her. Despite everything, a spark had kindled in her eyes, something that looked remarkably like hope. The autumn winds swept through the village, carrying whispers that grew sharper than the mountain air. The harvest had yielded barely half what they needed. and empty stomachs bred fear. In the cramped spaces between cabins, villagers huddled, their voices low but accusatory. "Since that girl arrived, nothing's been right," muttered a woman, clutching her thin shawl. "The mountain is angry." Emily Davis kept her head down as she collected water from the creek, feeling the weight of stares on her back. She'd grown used to the sideways glances, but hunger had transformed suspicion into something more dangerous. Robbie Johnson saw opportunity in the villagers' fear. The blacksmith's forge had become a gathering place where he held court. His powerful arms crossed as he nodded gravely at each new complaint. "John thinks he's above our ways," Robert told the gathered men one evening, the firelight casting dramatic shadows across his face. "He brings this stranger among us, ignores the old rituals, and now look, the mountain punishes us all." He struck his anvil for emphasis, the sound echoing like thunder. Sarah Brown heard these accusations from her small home at the village edge. The healer had lived through 83 winters and recognized the dangerous pattern forming. That evening, she made her way to the village square where Thomas Brown sat with the council. "The mountain always tests us before blessing," Sarah reminded them, her voice frail but commanding respect. "This poor harvest is no different than the one 16 years past, or the one before that." The elder nodded slowly, stroking his beard. "Sarah speaks truth, yet the rituals must be honored." "And they will be," she assured him, though doubt clouded her eyes when she turned away. Later, Sarah visited John's cabin, finding him teaching Emily to preserve what little they'd gathered. The girl worked diligently, her thin fingers moving with increasing confidence. "The village is restless," Sarah warned. "Robert speaks against you both." John Smith barely looked up. "Let him talk. We'll manage. Pride won't fill empty bellies," the healer cautioned, "and Emily's presence raises questions I cannot answer." She studied the girl with concern. "There are protections we've observed for generations, rituals before bringing strangers to the mountain." Emily paused her work, sensing she was the subject of their conversation. "She's just a child," John argued. "No," Sarah replied, watching Emily's careful movements. "She's something more, something the mountain recognizes." She sighed heavily. "And that's what frightens them." As Sarah departed, Emily looked to John with questioning eyes. He had no answers to give her, only a reassuring nod before returning to their work. Outside, the wind carried the sound of Robert's hammer, beating like a war drum against the coming winter. The third blizzard in a week howled outside, rattling the shutters of John Smith's cabin. Snow had piled against the door, forming a wall that took nearly an hour to clear each morning. Inside, the fire struggled against the bitter cold that seeped through every crack in the weathered logs. John stared at their dwindling supplies, a handful of dried meat, some withered root vegetables, and barely enough firewood to last another week. Emily huddled beneath two threadbare blankets in the corner, her thin frame shivering despite her efforts to hide it. She hadn't complained once, even as their meals grew smaller and the cabin colder. The girl's quiet endurance only made John's failure feel more acute. "We need to go to the village," he finally said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. Emily's eyes widened. She knew what this admission cost him: 15 years of self-imposed exile, of needing no one and nothing but his own two hands. "I'll go alone," John added quickly, already pulling on his thickest fur coat. "You stay by the fire." But Emily was already on her feet, wrapping herself in the tattered shawl she'd arrived in. Her silent insistence was clear. They would face this together. The trek down the mountain path nearly broke them both. Wind cut through their clothing like knives, and the snow reached past their knees in places. Twice, John had to carry Emily through the deepest drifts, her body alarmingly light in his arms. When they finally stumbled into the village square, John braced himself for the rejection he'd convinced himself he deserved. Instead, Thomas Brown spotted them from his doorway and immediately called for help. Within moments, villagers emerged from their homes, faces etched with concern rather than the contempt John had expected. "Bring them to my hearth," Sarah called, her weathered hands already preparing remedies for the cold. The healer's home was warm and fragrant, with dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Emily's eyes darted around, taking in the bottles and bundles with obvious curiosity. Robert Johnson watched from the doorway, his massive arms crossed. The blacksmith's gaze was suspicious, but not hostile. "Bad winter to be alone up there," he remarked, his tone neutral. Mary, who had been visiting Sarah, pressed cups of hot tea into their frozen hands. "The trading routes are blocked," she explained. "We're all feeling the pinch." As warmth slowly returned to John's limbs, Sarah ladled thick stew into wooden bowls. She pressed one into his calloused hands, steam rising between them like an offering. "No one survives alone up here, John," she whispered. "Not even you." The hermit stared into the bowl, watching the steam rise. For 15 years, he'd convinced himself that solitude was strength, that needing others was weakness. Yet here they were, these people he'd avoided, sharing what little they had without question. Emily caught his eye from across the room, a tentative smile warming her face as she accepted her own bowl from Sarah. For the first time, John wondered if what he'd thought was independence had actually been fear all along. The winter wind screamed across the mountain, driving villagers into their homes as darkness fell. In John's cabin, the fire crackled against the cold, casting long shadows across the walls. Emily sat quietly by the hearth, her thin fingers working a piece of kindling into the flames. The hermit watched her from his chair, noticing how she'd grown less timid in recent weeks. As the storm intensified, John pulled his worn blanket tighter. "Worst blizzard this season," he muttered, more to himself than to the girl. Emily nodded, her eyes reflecting the dancing fire. Then, almost imperceptibly, she began to hum. The melody started so softly that John nearly missed it beneath the howling wind. Gradually, her voice grew stronger, words forming in a language John hadn't heard since childhood, an ancient mountain dialect few remembered. The lullaby filled the small cabin, weaving between the gaps in the log walls and drifting toward the village below. Her voice, clear as mountain water, carried notes of both sorrow and hope. John sat transfixed, memories of his mother singing the same tune flooding back unexpectedly. In the village square, Elder Thomas paused while securing his shutters. The old man tilted his head, certain he was imagining things. But there it was, a song he hadn't heard in 50 years, one sung only by descendants of the mountain's founding families. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the village blanketed in pristine snow. Sarah Brown trudged through the drifts toward John's cabin, curiosity driving her forward, despite her aching joints. The healer had heard whispers about the song that had somehow reached villagers through the howling storm. "The girl has questions to answer," Sarah announced upon entering. Emily shrank back slightly, but John positioned himself protectively between them. "She's done nothing wrong," the trapper insisted. Sarah's weathered face softened. "I'm not here to accuse, John. I'm here to understand." She approached Emily gently. "May I see your wrist, child?" Emily hesitantly extended her arm, revealing a faded ribbon tied there. Sarah examined the intricate pattern woven into the fabric. Blues and greens intertwined with silver threads in a design so distinct it made the old woman gasp. "This pattern," she whispered, "belongs to the oldest family in our mountains." Later that afternoon, Sarah brought Elder Thomas to see for himself. The village leader's hands trembled as he touched the ribbon, recognition dawning in his rheumy eyes. "My grandmother wore this pattern," Thomas confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "It was lost when," he trailed off, exchanging a meaningful glance with Sarah. That night, John watched Emily sleep, questions multiplying in his mind. The girl he'd impulsively rescued wasn't just any orphan. Somehow, her origins were deeply entwined with the mountain itself, and perhaps with secrets the village had long buried beneath the snow. The mountain snow melted in rivulets, carving paths through the thawing earth. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, but for John Smith, it brought unsettling revelations instead. He found Mary Johnson at the trading post, her weathered face unusually solemn as she motioned him to a quiet corner. "I need to tell you something about the girl," Mary said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I recognized her that day in the square, but kept quiet." She explained how 2 winters ago she'd traveled to the lowlands and seen Emily in the household of Lady Westfield, a noblewoman rumored to have fled her family in disgrace. The child was serving there, but treated differently than the other servants, the trader continued, fidgeting with a loose thread on her sleeve. The lady was protective of her, almost maternal. There were whispers about the girl's parentage. John's mind reeled. The silent, obedient girl who swept his cabin floors and learned to trap rabbits was connected to nobility? He'd assumed Emily was just another mountain orphan, sold into servitude like so many others. "Why tell me this now?" he demanded. Mary looked away. Conscience, perhaps. Or maybe because the mountain has ways of bringing truth to light, whether we wish it or not. That same evening, Sarah Brown appeared at his door, her healer's bag clutched in gnarled fingers. The elderly woman settled by the fire while Emily prepared tea, watching the girl with knowing eyes. "She has her mother's hands," Sarah observed quietly when Emily stepped outside to gather more firewood. "Quick, gentle, good healer's hands." John stared at her. "You knew her mother?" Sarah nodded slowly. 19 years ago, I helped a young woman from our village escape. She was carrying a child and feared for both their lives." The healer's eyes reflected the dancing flames. "The father was from the lowlands, a nobleman who had promised to return for her but never did." "Are you saying?" John couldn't finish the thought. "Emily is of both worlds, John. Mountain blood and lowland nobility." Sarah accepted the cup Emily brought upon returning. "The old prophecies speak of one who would bridge the divide between our people and theirs." John watched Emily move about the cabin, suddenly seeing her in a new light. Not just a girl he'd rescued on impulse, but perhaps someone the mountain itself had called home. The implications were staggering. Her past was not merely a mystery to be solved, but potentially the key to the village's future. "What happens now?" he asked. Sarah's gaze was steady. "That depends on you, John, and on her. The mountain has set events in motion that none of us can stop." Outside, the last of winter's grip loosened as spring claimed the land. Like the thaw, truths long buried were finally emerging into the light. Robert Johnson burst through John's cabin door without knocking, his face flushed with anger. In his calloused hand, he clutched a piece of sackcloth, waving it like evidence at a trial. "Explain this," the blacksmith demanded, thrusting the fabric forward. There, etched in charcoal, was the unmistakable symbol of an anvil, the mark of the Johnson family's forge for 3 generations. John Smith stood slowly, positioning himself between Robert and Emily, who shrank back against the wall. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice deliberately calm. "Found it among her things when she was helping Sarah gather herbs," Robert spat. "My father's mark, my grandfather's before him." He pointed an accusatory finger at Emily. "This girl isn't some random orphan. She's connected to my family, and you knew it all along." The blacksmith paced the small cabin, his massive frame making the space feel even more confined. "Is this some scheme to undermine me? The village council votes on leadership next month. Is that what this is about?" John sighed, genuinely confused. "I know nothing about your family mark or village politics. I bought her to save her, nothing more." Emily Davis watched from the corner, her thin fingers clutching a broom handle. Weeks of whispers, suspicious glances, and being treated like a curse had worn her down. The sackcloth had been among her few possessions when John purchased her freedom, a link to a past she barely remembered. Later that evening, after Robert had stormed out with threats of further investigation, John instructed Emily to clean the hearth before bed. It was a simple task she'd performed countless times, but something in her had changed. "No," she said, the word barely audible. John turned, certain he'd misheard. "The hearth needs cleaning before morning." Emily placed the broom against the wall, her eyes meeting his directly for the first time since she'd arrived. "I said no. I've already swept the floor 3 times today. The hearth can wait until tomorrow." The silence that followed was deafening. John had grown accustomed to her silent obedience, her ghost-like presence fulfilling every command without question. This small act of defiance shook him more than Robert's accusations. "You don't give orders here," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Neither do you own me," Emily replied, her voice small but unyielding. "You bought my freedom, not my soul." The shock of her defiance rippled through the cabin. John stared at the girl, no, the young woman standing before him. For the first time, he saw not just the obedient servant he'd rescued, but the strength of a spirit yearning for freedom, for dignity. In that moment, something shifted between them. John recognized the truth he'd been avoiding. In saving Emily, he'd taken responsibility not just for her survival, but for her becoming. The autumn air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke as villagers gathered for the weaving of blessing ceremony. Emily Davis stood at the edge of the circle, her thin frame wrapped in a shawl Sarah had lent her. The ritual, performed only once a year, was meant to bind the community together through the coming winter. Baskets of colored yarn and herbs sat at the center of the gathering, waiting to be woven into patterns that would protect the village. Thomas Brown, his weathered face solemn in the firelight, raised his gnarled hands for silence. The elder's voice, though frail with age, carried across the hushed crowd. "The mountain speaks through signs," he announced, his eyes finding Emily in the crowd. "And it has shown me that this child," he pointed directly at her, "is claimed by the mountain spirit itself." Gasps rippled through the assembly. Some villagers crossed themselves, while others exchanged worried glances. Emily froze, uncertain whether to run or stand her ground, as all eyes turned to her. "What does that mean?" someone called out. "It means the old prophecies are stirring," Thomas replied. "The one who bridges worlds has returned." John Smith shifted uncomfortably beside Emily. He hadn't wanted to attend the ceremony at all, but Sarah had insisted it would look worse if they stayed away. Now he regretted the decision as he watched fear and wonder battle across the villagers. Faces. Robert Johnson pushed to the front, his blacksmith's arms crossed over his chest. "Are we supposed to believe this girl is some kind of chosen one?" he scoffed. "She's nothing but trouble, brought by a man who turned his back on us years ago." Several voices murmured in agreement, while others hissed for silence. The division was immediate and palpable, those who saw Emily as a threat versus those who dared to hope she represented something more. Sarah stepped forward, her healer's pouch swinging at her hip. "The old ways and the new must find balance," she said firmly. Emily may be the key to that balance. John placed a protective hand on Emily's shoulder, but she surprised him by stepping forward on her own. The girl who had once trembled at every command now stood straight-backed before the village, her eyes clear and unafraid. "I don't know what I am," she said softly, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. "But I am grateful to be here." The simple words seemed to diffuse some of the tension. Thomas nodded approvingly, while Robert turned away with a disgusted grunt. Walking home that night, John realized with a mixture of pride and unease that he could no longer shield Emily from whatever fate awaited her. The mountain had claimed her, just as surely as he had claimed her in the village square months ago. Her destiny was unfolding beyond his control, and all he could do was walk beside her as the path revealed itself. The winter winds howled fiercely around John Smith's cabin, piling snow against the wooden walls until the structure seemed more like a white hill than a dwelling. Inside, the hermit worked methodically, repairing a damaged floorboard near the hearth that had begun to warp from years of heat and moisture. As he pried up the weathered plank, something caught his eye. A leather-bound journal wedged between the support beams. John's calloused fingers trembled slightly as he recognized it immediately. This belonged to Michael, his brother who had perished 5 winters ago in an avalanche that had claimed 3 villagers. "What were you hiding, Michael?" he whispered, brushing dust from the worn cover. By lantern light, John began reading the journal entries. The handwriting was unsteady, growing increasingly erratic toward the final pages, written during his brother's illness before the fatal expedition. What he discovered made his throat tighten. Michael had written of visions, of a child born of mountain and lowland blood, destined to return to the village when the community needed healing most. A girl with silence in her voice, but thunder in her spirit, one passage read. She will come when the village forgets its heart. Look for her in the traitor's shadow. John glanced toward Emily's sleeping form in the corner. The girl had fashioned a small space for herself, neat and orderly despite their meager possessions. Her breathing was steady, peaceful, unaware of the prophecy that seemed to have foretold her arrival. The trapper ran his hand across his beard, mind racing. Michael had known. Somehow, his brother had anticipated Emily's coming, perhaps even orchestrated events from beyond to ensure John would be there that day in the square. "Damn you, Michael," he muttered, though there was no real anger in his voice, only the ache of realization. Sarah Brown had once told John that the mountain chose its own instruments. He had dismissed the healer's words as superstition, the ramblings of an old woman clinging to outdated beliefs. Now, he wasn't so certain. The knowledge left John deeply conflicted. After Michael's death, he had sworn never to let another soul depend on him, never to risk the pain of loss again. His solitude had been his shield. Yet fate, or his brother's meddling from beyond, had bound him to Emily in ways he could never have anticipated. The girl stirred in her sleep, murmuring words from a language John didn't recognize. He closed the journal, sliding it beneath his own thin mattress. Tomorrow would bring enough challenges without burdening Emily with this discovery. For tonight, he would keep his brother's prophecy to himself, another secret to carry up on this unforgiving mountain. The snow retreated from the village like a defeated army, revealing muddy paths and the first stubborn shoots of green. With spring came truth, spilling forth like the mountain streams. Emily Davis's heritage, long shrouded in mystery, emerged through fragments of stories, memories, and the journal John had discovered. She carries both bloodlines, Sarah Brown announced during a tense gathering at the village square. The healer's weathered hands trembled slightly as she displayed Emily's ribbon alongside pages from old records. Mountain and lowland joined in one child. The revelation sparked immediate division. Villagers clustered in heated groups, their voices rising with the afternoon wind. Some saw Emily as an abomination, a threat to traditions that had sustained them for generations. Others recognized opportunity, a chance to heal ancient wounds between mountain folk and the prosperous lowlanders who had long looked down upon them. "She doesn't belong here," Robert insisted, pounding his fist against the wooden post. The blacksmith's face flushed with indignation as he rallied supporters. "The mountain spirits have shown their displeasure since her arrival. Crops failing, rock slides. How much more evidence do we need?" Thomas Brown, his authority evident in his slow, deliberate movements, raised a hand for silence. "The mountain tests before it blesses," the elder reminded them. "Perhaps this child is not our curse, but our bridge." John Smith stood apart, arms crossed and jaw set in stubborn determination. No longer the hermit who avoided village affairs, he had become something unexpected, a defender, a voice for change. The trapper caught Emily's gaze across the crowd and nodded slightly, a silent promise of protection. "I found her, I paid for her, and I'll stand for her," John declared, his voice cutting through the arguments. "Anyone who wants her gone deals with me first." Mary Johnson, who had once sold Emily without a second thought, stepped forward unexpectedly. "The girl has harmed no one," the trader said, surprising herself with her own defense. "And if she truly bridges our world with the lowlands, imagine the trading possibilities." Emily herself stood straight-backed amid the storm of words. The once silent girl who had trembled at every command now watched the village debate her existence with quiet dignity. Her hands, once soft but now calloused from mountain work, twisted the ribbon that connected her to both worlds. As dusk fell, the village remained divided, but John's stance had shifted something fundamental. He was no longer fighting just for Emily's safety, but for a future where belonging wasn't determined by blood alone. Old grudges bubbled to the surface, and fears of change threatened the fragile peace. But in Emily's steady gaze, a new possibility had taken root, one that neither mountain nor lowland could claim exclusively as their own. The village gathering hall, a weathered structure of stone and timber, buzzed with angry voices as Robert Johnson stood atop a wooden crate, his muscular blacksmith's frame silhouetted against the firelight. His fist pounded the air with each accusation. 3 sheep dead, milk turned sour, the spring planting delayed. Robert's voice boomed across the crowded space. And when did these troubles begin? When that girl arrived. He pointed toward Emily, who stood quietly beside John, her eyes fixed on the rough-hewn floorboards. Villagers murmured in agreement, fear making them eager to find a simple cause for their complex troubles. Robert's followers, nearly a third of the village, nodded vigorously, emboldened by their leader's certainty. "The mountain demands balance," the blacksmith continued, stroking his beard dramatically. "And we've disrupted it by harboring this outsider." John Smith could no longer contain himself. He stepped forward, his weathered face flushed with anger, placing himself between Emily and her accusers. "Enough!" John's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "You blame a child for your misfortunes because it's easier than facing the truth, that life here has always been hard," Robert sneered. "The hermit defends his purchase. How touching." The crowd shifted uncomfortably as John advanced toward Robert, tension crackling between them like static before a storm. "You want to blame someone?" John shouted, his voice echoing off the wooden beams. "Blame me, not the girl. I brought her here. I challenged your precious traditions. Your quarrel is with me." Robert's hand moved toward the hammer at his belt. "Perhaps it's time we settled this, Smith." The blacksmith's followers pressed forward, and for a heartbeat, violence seemed inevitable. Emily reached for John's arm, her fingers trembling against his sleeve. "Stop this madness." Sarah Brown's voice, though thin with age, carried authority as she pushed through the crowd. The elderly healer positioned herself between the two men, her eyes sharp with disapproval. Elder Thomas followed, his walking stick tapping a solemn rhythm against the floor. "The mountain's will," he announced, "is greater than any man's anger or fear." He fixed Robert with a stern gaze. "Or ambition." The blacksmith faltered under the elder's scrutiny. "We have survived here for generations," Thomas continued, "not by casting out those who are different, but by finding strength in what each brings." He gestured toward Emily. "This child carries old blood. The mountain has claimed her, whether you like it or not." Sarah nodded, placing a protective hand on Emily's shoulder. "Blame and fear solve nothing. We must work together, or none will survive the coming seasons." The tension in the room gradually subsided, like air escaping a punctured bladder. Robert stepped down from his crate, defeated for now, but not convinced. The villagers dispersed in small clusters, their unity as fragile as spring ice, ready to crack at the slightest pressure. Sarah Brown watched Emily carefully as the girl's slender fingers sorted dried herbs with surprising precision. For weeks now, the elderly healer had observed how animals calmed at Emily's touch and how villagers' pain seemed to ease when she applied simple remedies under Sarah's guidance. "You have the gift," Sarah said one afternoon, her weathered hands resting on her walking stick. "I've seen it before, but rarely this strong." Emily Davis looked up, her eyes widening with something between fear and hope. "I just do what you show me." The healer shook her head. "No, child. What you have can't be taught. It can only be guided." She gestured to the shelves of remedies lining her small home. "I'm not getting any younger. These mountains need someone to remember the old ways when I'm gone." That evening, Sarah approached John Smith outside his cabin. The trapper was skinning a rabbit, his movements efficient and practiced. "The girl has healing in her hands," she told him bluntly. "I want to take her as my apprentice." John's knife paused mid-cut. "She helps me here. She can help everyone," Sarah countered, "including you when your bones ache from cold and age." The hermit said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He had grown accustomed to Emily's quiet presence in his cabin, the way she anticipated his needs, how her silent efficiency had become part of his daily rhythm. "She would still live with you," Sarah added, sensing his reluctance. "But she would spend days with me, learning." That night, John watched Emily as she prepared their simple meal. Her movements were no longer those of the frightened servant he'd purchased in the village square. She moved with purpose now, with dignity. "Sarah wants to teach you," he said gruffly. Emily froze, a wooden spoon hovering above the pot. "To be a healer? Says you have the gift for it." The girl's face transformed with a rare smile. "Do you think I could learn?" John felt something twist inside him. He had saved her, protected her, but he had never considered what she might become beyond these cabin walls. The thought of her finding her own path, one that might eventually lead away from him, left him feeling hollow. "You should do it," he said finally, his voice rough. "The village needs a healer. Sarah won't live forever." Emily approached him cautiously. "I would still be here, still help you." "I don't need help," John replied automatically, then sighed. "But the others do, and you deserve more than just surviving." The next morning, when Sarah arrived at the cabin door, John nodded once before turning back to his traps. It was the closest he could come to admitting that Emily's future might lie beyond the boundaries he had built around them both. Mary Johnson trudged up the steep path to John's cabin, her trader's instincts warring with an unfamiliar sense of moral obligation. The weight of her knowledge pressed heavier than the pack on her shoulders. For weeks, she'd been turning over the truth about Emily's heritage in her mind, calculating its value in the lowland markets. Such information could fetch a handsome sum from the right buyers. The trader paused at the cabin door, recalling how Emily had tended her sprained ankle last month with a gentle touch and herbs gathered from the mountainside. The girl who had once trembled like a leaf now moved with quiet confidence, her kindness extending even to those who had once seen her as merchandise. "There are people asking questions," Mary announced without preamble when John opened the door. "Strangers in fine clothes, showing sketches that look remarkably like her." She nodded toward Emily, who was grinding herbs at the table. "They're offering silver for information." John's face hardened instantly. "Who sent them?" His hands clenched into fists, the protective instinct that had driven him to intervene in the village square now flaring anew. "Nobility from the eastern valleys," the trader replied. "They speak of bloodlines and inheritance." "They're determined, John. They won't stop searching." Emily set down her mortar and pestle, her movements deliberate. "What exactly did they say about me?" Her voice was soft but steady, no longer the whisper of a frightened child. Mary studied her face. "They claim you're the daughter of a highborn woman who fled scandal. There's property involved, and titles perhaps." John paced the small cabin, already formulating plans to hide deeper in the mountains. "We'll leave before dawn," he muttered. "There's an old trapper's route that few remember." "No." Emily's single words stopped him mid-stride. The silence that followed stretched taut between them. "I want to know who I am," she continued, meeting John's startled gaze. "I need to face this, not run from it." John stared at her as though seeing someone entirely new. The obedient girl who had swept his floors and fetched his water without complaint had vanished. In her place stood a young woman with resolve etched across her features. "It's dangerous," he argued, but the words sounded hollow even to his ears. Emily smiled faintly. "You taught me how to read animal tracks and weather signs. Sarah has shown me how to heal wounds and ease suffering. I'm not helpless anymore." Mary watched the exchange with newfound respect. The girl she had once sold for a pouch of silver now possessed something far more valuable than coin: the courage to claim her own destiny. John's shoulders sagged slightly as realization dawned. He had rescued Emily from bondage only to discover that true freedom meant she might choose a path that led away from him. The village square transformed under the soft glow of lanterns as preparations for the spring festival reached their peak. Garlands of early wildflowers draped between wooden posts, and the scent of roasting meat mingled with pine smoke. For generations, this celebration had marked renewal after the harsh mountain winters, but this year carried a different energy, a cautious hope that something fundamental had changed. Emily Davis emerged from Sarah's home wearing a hand-woven shawl of deep blue and silver threads, a gift from the old healer who had spent weeks teaching her the traditional patterns. The girl who had once cowered at every glance now stood tall, her eyes clear and focused. John Smith waited nearby, uncomfortable in his freshly washed clothes, but determined to honor the occasion. "You look like you belong here," he said gruffly, the closest he could come to expressing pride. Emily smiled, touching the intricate weave of her shawl. "Sarah says it's the pattern her grandmother taught her." The procession began with Elder Thomas leading the way, his staff marking the rhythm for the village to follow. John and Emily fell in line, walking side by side, rather than the former following the latter like a shadow. Villagers noticed the change, how the hermit no longer hovered protectively, how the girl no longer flinched at sudden movements. Children broke from their parents' sides, dancing around Emily with curious eyes. A small girl offered her a twisted crown of early spring flowers. Emily accepted it with grace that belied her years of servitude, placing it atop her head as naturally as if she'd been receiving such gifts all her life. "Look how she carries herself now," Sarah whispered to Mary Johnson, who had returned for the festival with her trading cart. "Not like someone bought and sold." The trader nodded, watching the transformation with a mixture of guilt and wonder. "The mountain changes us all, I suppose." When the procession reached the ancient stone circle at the edge of the village, Thomas raised his hands for silence. The villagers gathered close, even Robert standing respectfully despite his lingering suspicions. "The mountain spirit works in ways we cannot always understand," the elder announced, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "It brings storms and sunshine, hardship and blessing." He beckoned Emily forward, placing weathered hands on her shoulders. "And sometimes it places among us those who bridge worlds, who remind us of what we have forgotten." For the first time since her arrival, laughter and music surrounded Emily without undertones of fear. John watched from a few steps back, his usual scowl softened by something that might have been contentment. The girl he had impulsively rescued was finding her place, not as his ward, but as her own person. The strangers arrived at dawn, 3 well-dressed figures on sturdy mountain horses, their polished leather boots and fine woolen cloaks marking them as lowlanders of means. They came asking for a girl matching Emily Davis's description, claiming blood rights and inheritance matters that required her immediate return. Word spread through the village like wildfire. By midday, the community had fractured into opposing camps. Robert Johnson stood in his forge doorway, arms crossed over his broad chest, loudly proclaiming this as an opportunity for trade agreements and protection from powerful allies. "We've struggled alone long enough," the blacksmith argued to anyone who would listen. These lowlanders have resources we need. Sarah Brown shook her head wearily as she gathered herbs in her garden. The mountain protects its own, she muttered to Thomas. The elder nodded gravely, his weathered face creased with concern. Both remembered too well how lowland interests had threatened their way of life before. John Smith paced his cabin floor, the floorboards creaking beneath his heavy steps. Emily sat quietly by the hearth, her thin fingers working a piece of wool Sarah had given her. "We could leave tonight," he said gruffly. "Head deeper into the mountains where they won't follow." Emily looked up, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "And then what? Keep running forever?" Her question hung in the air between them. John turned away, unable to meet her gaze. The journal he'd discovered months ago lay open on the table, his brother's prophecy a haunting reminder that this moment had been foretold. Outside, Mary approached the cabin, glancing nervously over her shoulder. The trader had recognized one of the visitors, a steward she'd encountered in the lowland markets who represented a wealthy family, rumored to have lost a daughter years ago. "They're offering gold for information," Mary told John when he cracked open the door. "Half the village is ready to point them here by nightfall." That evening, as shadows lengthened across the valley, Emily stood before John. Gone was the trembling, silent girl he'd purchased in the square. In her place stood a young woman with quiet determination in her stance. "I need to face them," she said. "Not hide, not run." John's hands clenched into fists, then slowly relaxed. The protective roar that had driven him to intervene that day in the square still burned in his chest, but something else had grown alongside it: respect. Emily touched the woven ribbon at her wrist, a symbol of her dual heritage. "Will you stand with me when I meet them?" John looked at her, not as a child to be sheltered, but as a person making her own choice. He nodded once, his decision made. The morning dawned clear and bright, as villagers and outsiders gathered in the square, the same place where, seasons ago, John Smith had first bellowed those life-changing words. Now, he stood back, his weathered hands clenched at his sides, watching Emily step forward to face her destiny. Emily Davis stood tall, no longer the trembling, silent girl he'd purchased with a pouch of silver. Her eyes, once downcast, now met the gaze of both the mountain people and the well-dressed lowlanders who claimed kinship. The hand-woven shawl Sarah had made draped across her shoulders, a symbol of her acceptance in the village. "I belong to neither world entirely," she announced, her voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "But I am a daughter of both." Thomas Brown nodded approvingly, leaning on his walking stick. The elder had seen many seasons come and go, but never had he witnessed such a moment of potential transformation for their isolated community. The lowlanders shifted uncomfortably, their fine clothes marking them as strangers. They had come expecting to reclaim a lost child, not to negotiate with a young woman who spoke with such clarity of purpose. "The mountain has shaped me," Emily continued, gesturing toward John, "and this man taught me strength when I had forgotten my own." John swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion he'd never allowed himself to show. He caught Sarah's knowing glance from across the square, the healer's eyes twinkling with approval. Robert stood with arms crossed, his blacksmith's frame tense but no longer hostile. Even he could not deny the change in the village since Emily's arrival. How wounds had begun to heal, how old traditions found new meaning. Mary approached John quietly. "You did right by her," the trader murmured. "More than I did." "We all did what we thought necessary," John replied, watching Emily negotiate terms that would open trade routes between mountain and lowland, while preserving the village's independence. As agreements were reached and hands clasped in newfound alliance, John realized that his solitary cabin would feel emptier now. Emily would travel between worlds, carrying messages and medicines, building bridges where walls had stood for generations. Yet for the first time, the thought of solitude didn't comfort him. The village no longer felt like a threat but a community, one that had space even for a gruff hermit who'd learned to care again. That evening, as villagers and visitors shared a feast around crackling fires, John found himself seated between Sarah and Emily, part of something larger than his own pain. The mountain peaks stood silent against the darkening sky, witnesses to the courage it took not just to survive alone, but to truly belong.